Hi, I'm Bill Patton with USA Tennis Coach, and I'm back with Dave Smith, and we're going to talk today about the next step in the progression of how we teach people, and that is going to be ground strokes, because, it's obviously really important to teach serves and return of serves, and, some people like to start players at the net with volleys and hitting some slices and all that before doing ground strokes. So, this is going to be like we were talking about on the pre-show. It's going to be like the Star Wars saga, where it started with episode 4. So this watch this one after you've watched the other ones that don't exist yet. All right, like you'd have to see how Darth Vader became Darth Vader in episode 3. That's really important. All right, so Dave, let's talk a little bit about where do you start in the development of ground strokes. But before you do, I just wanted to kind of like give the outline for the talk, and that's that we're going to ping pong back and forth about our entry places in the system of teaching ground strokes. Then we're going to get into some of the well-noted other people who teach, who have had wildly great success teaching and been very influential. And then we're going to kind of get into some of the things that are taught and then maybe aren't understood or are taught poorly and make people suffer. So anyway, so where do you start with ground strokes after you've done all your other progression?
Great segue there. You definitely start, we start with the backhand. As we were talking also in the pre-show, my progression, we move to the two-handed backhand, because we are still focusing on a continental grip, which, prior to this, we talk about volleys and serves. But the two-handed backhand is the first dynamic ground stroke we introduce. I love the balance. I love the fact that we are introducing two hands on the ground stroke. You may have read my books where I talk about the two-handed forehand even. We'll talk a little bit about that maybe later. But one of the interesting things that when I was speaking in Florida at a USPTA World Convention, a good friend of mine, Walt Oden, was talking about he was actually lecturing too, about two halves of the brain, right brain, left brain, and how our right hand and our right side of our body technically are controlled by the left side of our brain and vice versa. And his talk was about how important the two-handed backhand was, and why it became such a viable weapon, because it integrated both hands, which brought into play, I don't know all the new neurological, scientific aspects of it, but it did bring in both halves of the brain more succinctly. And so players were integrating both halves of the brain with the two-handed backhand. When I was speaking at the conference on the two-handed forehand, he pulled me aside and said, I'm an idiot. He said, why wouldn't I address that on the forehand as well? Well, I'll talk about that in a minute. But anyway, we start with the backhand, and we start with a continental grip, Eastern forehand on the left hand, and we teach the two-handed backhand in a very basic neutral stance, racket down low, kind of a Leighton Hewitt style backhand or a Serena Williams style backhand, although she hits hers a little bit open stance. But we start with the low backswing to the contact point. There's key position points that they follow, and then at the end of the stroke, hold their finish, so they learn to be balanced.
Okay, so what are those key position points, and what do you call them? How do you demonstrate those?
The first one is, of course, on the backswing to get the racket below the ball's contact point. So they can get, a lot of kids, they take the racket back, a lot of the adults even, and they get it up above the ball like a loop, but they never get the racket down below the ball in time to hit a topspin. So we start almost touching the ground if a player is not showing that they are understanding or feeling where the racket should be. They start with the racket, literally almost the tip of the racket touching the ground. Then as the ball comes, they literally come up through that contact point, keeping the right elbow in, left arm out, and extended out to the contact point. So the first one is the racket down by the left hip, if you're right-handed.
Okay.
Point it down, come to the contact point. We also look at, I don't know if you can see it on your screen, but the right forearm is parallel with the racket in a straight line in almost every top two-handed backhand in the world. There's a couple exceptions. So that's a key position point. At contact, the arm continues up, and we, of course, get to the kiss the bicep, over the shoulder, just a standard, very conventional, almost old school kind of backhand. Because here's a couple things that I found in 45 years of teaching. One is every player will develop a loop swing. I've never had to teach a loop swing, and every one of my players has a different loop swing, but it's their loop swing. And if you look at the pros, you'll see the same thing. I've seen pros actually teach at a club I used to teach at, would force players to do a very specific loop. And they'd have players who literally couldn't get below the ball to hit topspin over and over and over. And that's like they refused to teach the straight back, point it down, so the player could at least feel the racket coming from low to high. So those are some of the key positions.
There's an interesting thing that I've discovered is that part of that problem of people who can't hit topspin is a visual issue where they actually are seeing the ball as being lower than it is, or no, higher than it is. So they end up not able to get into there. But anyway, now, okay, this is very interesting, and I don't want to get too much into the weeds right now, but my entry point is that I like to teach the chunk. I like to show the entire stroke and really demonstrate, coming, all the way through, and how one thing that I've been influenced by Jack Brody is the concept that a stroke looks like a waveform. It looks like a check mark or a figure eight, right?
Sure.
So having that whole chunk really understood first is really what is really big for me. And then the other thing is I like to start people with their hands in front, and then get their racket to, prepared.
Sure.
And another thing that I've picked up from John Eagleton lately is the inverted start to the frame. So with the hands angled slightly forward, and then from there, then we do this. Now what I'll do from there is I'll say, all right, that's your drive. That's going to be about 70% of the shots you hit. Now we're going to go smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller until we get down to that Federer flick. And then we open it up and we go more circular and bigger and more circular. And then we go, all right, and here's Rafa Nadal, right? And then here's us leaning back because we've got a ball way over our head that we have to go get. So then giving them this entire range of different stroke paths that can meet with the incoming ball. So I usually astound my student by saying, all right, in the next 10 minutes, I'm going to teach you every possible ground stroke. So yeah.
Well, let me talk about two things you brought up. One is obviously you're talking about forehand prep. You're describing a forehand. I mean, at least what you were.
Okay. Well,
obviously, just want to clarify that.
Yeah. Well, and the backhand prep would be different, but I still go through the same process on the backhand.
That's what I was going to say. The second part of that is we do show the entire we make sure the student sees the entire stroke. If you look at several books on learning and when I used to write for tennis1.com as senior editor, we talked a lot about chunking, meaning taking a full gross motor skill, such as a forehand or a backhand, a serve, or whatever, and breaking it into recognizable, not only recognizable, but parts that the player can associate with, feel, recognize. Because I've taught 3,500 players, and I would say a good number of those, once their racket got back behind their eyesight, they had no idea where it was. They had no idea where it was. They did not know if I've had players where I'd say hit a top spin and they were hitting a slice. They had no idea. I even told one night, I said, hey, everyone in the class, that was a great top spin. Julie, whatever her name was, hey, that was a great slice. And she goes, oh, no, I was hitting top spin. And it was not even close. So, one of the things that I think go together is what you're talking about is what we want the players to visualize or see as a whole stroke, and then being able to break it down so that they can emulate it. All players have a different ability or a concept of what they can recognize within a stroke pattern. And
Yes.
so when
Okay,
we break it down into the key position points that they can check, look at, finish, and it's no different than playing the piano when you first learn scales or learn a guitar. You learn these little patterns. Sure, you can play Flight of the Bumblebee on the piano as far as listening to it. You're not going to play it within 2 years at that level. But if you break it down into the elements, then we'll do it. And that's
right.
just my personal preference.
So I'm glad you brought up chunking, because I think it's not a good practice when people sort of try to teach little elements of the stroke, and that somehow the student is going to reconcile all of those. So when you show them and demonstrate, the whole thing, then when you break it down, they're better able to reconcile all those pieces.
It can go both ways. I mean, I had no problem with my players learning what I call advanced foundation stroke.
Hold on a second. Let me finish this thought. I'll hand it back to you. But anyway, the problem is I see a lot of players who sort of create this checklist in their mind of the 5 things that have to happen consecutively for them to have a stroke, and then I can see them thinking about each piece, and by that time the ball's gone, right?
Sure.
So the chunking helps alleviate a lot of what I like to say, drop the checklist, put the checklist away. What we'll do is see, here's your whole system. Now let's just pay attention to one aspect of this whole thing.
Right.
So.
Well, I think that you have validity, but you also have to look at it from my perspective. Our first drill, we do not feed balls. We drop feed balls. So the ball is not coming to them. So they have plenty of time. Even before that, we use a practice hit or coach's eye or any one of those devices that's even better from the standpoint. We don't want them to worry about where the ball is going. We don't want them to, because once a player starts to evaluate their swing based on where the ball is going, they're going to change their swing to accommodate the aim. We want them to accommodate the aim we want them to accommodate the swing by changing the aim. We don't want them to change the stroke to accommodate the aim.
I love that.
So
I love that, and I know players hate that sometimes because they want to succeed in their own mind. Yeah.
Every player. That's why we don't let players. Literally, we don't really let players start to rally. I mean, and this is all relative. I mean, within 1 or 2 lessons, we're doing more and more live ball because the players are adapting to the advanced foundation faster through this process. My players hit, anywhere between, in a typical 2-hour session with my group of players on my team, with 9 teaching carts at 325 balls each, we're hitting, we figure about 12,000 balls every 10 to 12 minutes. So each player's hitting 300 or 400 balls. So they're able to get into the sequence and get that chunking portion very quickly acclimated to a smooth pattern, which is what I think you are referring to in terms of the players being able to just get to a stroke. And by golly, you're absolutely right in terms of if a player demonstrates that they're able to get the racket below the ball, come through, staying sideways and not, reverse pivoting out or opening up their shoulder plane or pushing or slapping down and chopping at it and going back to so many things that most players, that's all they know because they're raw beginners. They don't know these patterns, and these advanced foundation stroke patterns are not usually very comfortable. They're not familiar, and they're not natural. Through the process of training them, they make the uncomfortable comfortable. They make the familiar become familiar. And so the players, this whole concept of a lot of coaches saying, we let them do whatever feels comfortable, what's natural. Well, I'm sorry, playing the piano with all 10 fingers is not natural. It does not come natural for anybody.
Right.
And so tennis is no different. Golf is no different. My daughter's a world-class golfer. I mean, we broke her swing down, as well as the pros that she's worked with, into recognizable patterns that she made comfortable through practice. She wasn't the world's greatest athlete, but you became a world-class athlete through those kind of practices.
Okay. All right. So now what do you see as the most important element of a stroke, and how do you teach it?
The most important thing is, I have several phrases I've coined over the years in my books. One of them is probably the most important to answer your question. Keep the plane the same. That simple phrase. So if I'm talking about forehand, a volley, a backhand volley, backhand topspin, a slice approach shot, if my racket face is rolling, dishing, flipping, flicking, that will destroy and pollute the stroke, especially within the contact window. So every time I hit a ball, the racket face is at a different orientation, and aiming is ridiculous because you can't. If the racket's changing on every shot, you can't possibly start to aim because the racket is changing on each subsequent shot. Mm-hmm. So the first thing we train is keep the plane the same. So if it's a simple volley, we actually have another phrase called set and hold. Mm-hmm. And what that refers to is if a ball's coming to my backhand, I get my racket set to the target, I find the ball, I slice the ball, I hold my finish, so my racket is still pointed to the target, so I set, I hit, and I hold. Mm-hmm. If I'm hitting a topspin, I'm going to keep the plane the same, I'm going to hold my finish. So I have a repeatable, reliable swing path on command, and the racket's doing the same thing every time I hit the ball. Now I can aim.
Okay, awesome. And what I really like to do, I really like to get into the contact point. So
sure.
So I'll get every level player can refine their contact point, right? So with beginners, it's a little more difficult because they haven't made the connection that this thing that they have in their hand makes their arm longer, right? So,
right.
I like to get them up to the net, put their racket in an ideal contact point with their hand in a place where their forearms delivering leverage onto the ball, and then place the ball right there, right? And then have them bring their racket back and see how far that ball is from them. So that ball's over here. So now look, your racket's there, the ball's there. Does the ball feel like it's far away, or does it feel like it's close? How does that feel to you, right? And they go, oh, it seems kind of far away. And then it's like, swing right there, boom, right? Yep. So training that contact point is something that can overcome a lot of idiosyncratic play. So
almost a reverse engineering from contact back and then back through and finding that ball. One thing that we do every day that kind of goes with what you're talking about is I wish I had a racket with me, I'm in my office. We do 150 up bounces, which means I'm keeping my elbow straight, my racket in a backhand, basically a backhand volley orientation. And I do 100 up bounces with that ball on the racket. Then we kneel down on our right knee if we're right-handed and do 100. And these are, of course, with continental grips. And then we're doing 100 down bounces or 150 down bounces. And we actually will put a little dot on the ground. We'll lick our finger, put a dot on the ground. So now they're not only bouncing the ball and learning where it is in relationship to their hand to the racket, but they're also learning subtle aiming of their racket face to try and make that ball bounce on that dot, or we use a line or whatever. So we're already before, when we start all of our practices, we do that as a group. I've had the #1 player in the country. I've had world-class players, and I've had raw beginners do these same drills. And if you do 150 down bounces, 150 up bounces, and we do catches where we toss the ball, we catch it on our string, catch it on both sides. And our players get to the point where they can catch the ball, throw it up, catch it, throw it up, catch it, catch it, catch it. So all those little dinky drills that take 2 minutes are training that very aspect so that when we get to a ground stroke drill, a volley drill, they're already familiar with where their racket orientation is relative to their body, their hand, and the ball itself.
Yeah, and from that, let me identify some things that are happening there, because when you do the downs, then you're feeling the force of the ball coming from the ground, right?
Correct.
When you do the ups, then you're feeling the force of the ball falling from the sky. And when
reflecting.
You do catches, you're developing that touch, the ability to have a considerable touch. So yeah, those are invaluable. And I would say, I mean, it's a great idea to spend, 3 to 5 minutes doing that stuff every day. Now, the next thing that I like to do, and this is where I start, every lesson starts this way, and this is something I got from Ken DeHart. And he probably got it from someplace else, I'm sure, right? Is
Yep.
starting with tossing a ball underhand back and forth.
Oh yeah, we do that every day.
Well,
Great.
because the preoccupation of many American tennis coaches is on sending skills, right? On hitting, stroking, right? But
Yep.
we need better receptive skills. So I would start people off in lesson 1. I go, hey, we're tossing the ball back and forth because tennis is a game of receiving and sending,
Cracking,
catching, and tossing. And then we choke up on the racket all the way up to the very top of the grip, and we have like a little dinkum rally, just very, very close. And this is where, when I inherit people who've come from other pros, they're almost always hitting or stroking and
No, I hear you.
They have no touch. And then what that does is it creates a baseline of starting with touch where now they can play the entire court, right? So you have this space that's 27 by 39
right
on one side, but people have this mentality that they should only try to hit through their opponent at the baseline, right? But if you start them with this catching and tossing and touch game up front, then they can hit a drop shot over there. And usually what I do is I go, hey, here's the reason why we do this: drop shot, and then and they get the surprise, and I'm like, see, you didn't see that coming. So it opens up a lot more of the court for them to play into.
Absolutely. Well, and I know this doesn't fit our ground stroke discussion here, but the first thing we teach is the volley, but the first volley we teach is a sharp angle volley. For that very reason, I want my players, because if you take a sharp angle volley from one sideline from the alley to the other alley parallel with the net, you're volleying the ball, not quite, but you're almost volleying the ball as deep as you would if you were hitting it straight ahead. But it moves the mindset of a player away from always hitting one-dimensional straight ahead mentality, and the drop shot is that other third level of you got dimensions, you got up and back dimension, up and down dimensions, and left and right dimensions.
Right.
Well, unfortunately, there's so many pros. I'm so much agree with you that we will get players, they can rally from the baseline, but they get into the net, they only can hit the ball deep. That's all they can do. They don't know how to hit the drop shot or an angle ball.
For a second. Now, I think the reason it fits, and I think the reason why we're going to have to do the video that is episode 3 is because taking from that volley and then scaling up, then you can get a really nice angled ground stroke that opens up the court.
Absolutely.
So I think it's far easier to scale up than it is to scale down.
I agree. And going back to your original question, what is the most important aspect of when we're introducing, say, a forehand or a backhand ground stroke, really goes into not only keep the playing the same, but the other equally important aspect, in my opinion, and I've got a lot of proof to prove this, but is spin. If players cannot generate spin, and the right kind of spin, meaning the axis of spin, on a serve or a ground stroke or a volley, whatever, if they don't generate spin, then they are suspect to two things. One is gravity, and one is the limited speed that the shot has to clear the net, but soft enough that gravity can bring the ball down. And if a player doesn't generate spin, the optimal spin, say top spin for a ground stroke, if they're hitting those flat, then the minute they hit the ball hard, they're going to either hit the net or hit the ball long. So back to the original statement, the importance, if we're going to identify things that are important, at least from my perspective, is I'm going to develop a stroke that is repeatable, reliable, and the plane's kept the same, and that it is hand in hand with what that swing should do to the ball, meaning how do I generate the right kind of spin and how do I maximize the right kind of spin so that I can hit the ball harder, hit it with greater angles. I can hit the ball higher over the net and hit more consistently, especially under pressure.
Okay, awesome. So we have 9 minutes left. And so here's what I want to do. I'm going to share 3 different things from 3 different of my influences.
Okay.
And then if you could share a couple of things from some of your influences and whatnot. And then let's get into some of the things that are either misnomers or not taught well or misunderstood or maybe just plain bad teaching, right?
Okay.
So one thing I really love from Oscar Wagner is the concept of going up and across. And the reason I like that is because of something I learned from Don Henson, is that when the brain knows what the final destination is, then it's a lot more confident along the path. So one thing I've started doing with my follow through, so we've got, contact point. I'm just obsessive about contact points. But once we've got that established, now what I want my players to do is put their thumb over their shoulder. Or I tell them, you can abbreviate that stroke, but it ought to be traveling in that arc. It could end here.
Yeah.
That's along this arc.
Right.
How many times? So then then finally, watching and listening to Robert Lansdorp teach, and Robert's amazing. I think it's amazing that he gets the results that he does, because basically it comes down to shouting over and over again, not like that, like this, hit through the ball, and just sort of repeating the same thing over and over again. And the person might not even understand what it is, but when they've done it right, then they know.
Right.
And I think that's really interesting, because it's so much simpler than what most people are willing to do, and also requires more discipline. So anyway, I'm done with my piece on that one. So you want to get into some of the kind of the special pieces of things you gathered from mentors?
I've done, when I've written books on tennis and whatnot, I remember speaking at a Southern Cal convention, and somebody was saying, how many drills have you personally invented? And everybody in the group was like, we just steal ideas and drills from everybody. And I'm like, well, I've invented a dozen drills that I've never seen anybody do. And so when I look at tennis, I don't look at everyone. Let me step back. When I go to a convention, say to listen to different pros speak, I'm probably speaking at it if I'm there. But what I'm doing, I had a good friend of mine, Mike Letcher, tell me, why do you go to these conventions, Dave? You know more than most of these guys that are speaking. I said, number one, I want to see if pros can either offer me something that I didn't know before, obviously, or can prove me wrong. And if they can prove me wrong, then I want to see the results of that, and I want to have a reason for it. I've been doing this for so long, and I don't think there's too many coaches and pros who have taught 3,500 players, including number 1 players in the country, top 20 in the world, all the way down to raw beginners. And so my understanding is generated more from my own experience, but also from all of these. I mean, Greg Patton, who was a great UCI coach, good friend of mine, who I just love and adore.
Yeah.
He's mini me, which is a basic volley drill where you hit it up to yourself and hit it over. Ken DeHart, who's just a genius in so many ways, and I've gotten a lot of wonderful things from Ken. But so many things are either little bits and pieces from different pros.
Yeah.
Jim McClellan. These some of the guys. Bill Tim. And some I don't agree with, like we were talking about earlier, is that there's so many ideas out there that I just kind of shake my head and go, do you really hear yourself?
Right. Okay. I want to get into the windshield wiper forehand, because my big issue with it is when people have sort of reduced the stroke into like a 2-dimensional thing almost.
Yeah.
And then, they like to say, oh, Rafa, blah, 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 and Essential Tennis did a really nice debunking of does Rafa hit a windshield wiper forehand. And what they found was that if he mishits in the lower part of the frame, that
Right.
it gives an optical illusion as though there was intentionality to that, but it's really an oops on his part. So, so anyway, so I mean, I think people are teaching to brush up fully on the ball, but I like to see people hitting to and through the ball, and I like to call it like a roll toss, rolling the ball forward, tossing it, or striking it with a lot of force that way. So that's my issue with the windshield wiper. Do you have more on that, or do you have another one?
I'm going to say I look at all the different, I mean, Doug King used to say, push the door open and turn the doorknob. And that was his wiper move. We've heard, and I've heard Oscar, of course, put the racket in the backpack, that kind of talk. And I've used all of them. I'll take that racket through the ball if a player is indeed hitting, for some reason, they're just, brushing up the ball so significantly, they're not getting any forward velocity. So I look at each player's need. I never box in a teaching philosophy as completely inaccurate, because for some players, if I tell them to wipe the ball or stand them in front of a fence and push the racket to the fence and then wipe, across, and so there are situations where
That's a great
something
point.
that would not necessarily be correct in terms of what Rafa's doing or what they actually do at the pro level, but it might indeed be the thing that clicks or the light bulb goes on. And now the player is indeed generating topspin, hitting through the ball, which is what we want. We want penetration. But as I mentioned before, I want spin. I joke with my kids, you'll never hear me say, oh, you're hitting too much spin. And if you want to see my kick serves and all my players, my girls, my guys hit kick serves, slice serves, hybrid serves, along with tossing it forward and driving a so-called flat serve. But John Yandel did a great study years ago showing the so-called flat serves of Pete Sampras, Ivanovich, or I'm not Ivanovich,
Even Isabel.
yeah, thank you, Roddick. Who did he do? Todd Martin. He did a number of studies.
Right.
And even at 130 miles an hour, these guys are serving with 2,000, 1,500 to 2,500 RPMs of spin on 130 mile an hour first serve.
Because
so they're not flat.
It's not going in. Yeah.
What's that?
Otherwise, it's not going in.
Right. I mean, I don't care if you're as tall as who's the Isner, John. To be that tall, you still have to be able to have some amount of topspin to clear the net and still make the ball arc in at 130. Not that my girls are serving 130. But.
All right. So I think I really like the point that you made, and I think that's a really strong take home is the idea of if the players find value in it, then it's a good thing. But I'm going to stand by what I said, though, that I do believe the windshield wiper forehand is over-taught. It's taught beyond what is valuable for a lot of players. So anyway.
No, I agree. I very seldom ever even mention a wiper move unless I see a player that's just coming down or hitting flat or not getting the feel yet. And all those patterns, whether it's going across the body or I like to come from inside going out and then back in, because now I'm hitting around the outside of the ball. Now I'm getting not only a topspin, I'm hitting around the ball to get a ball that curves down and curves away from the center of the court, which for a passing shot or opening the court up is another level of skill that makes my players better than my opponents. If I can pull my opponent 3 or 4 more feet off the court, I subsequently have a more open court to hit my next shot in.
Awesome. And my final word, and it's a reflection on something that you alluded to earlier, is that absolutely the coach ought to be looking for an inefficiency in the player, and that we ought to be customizing our coaching. What does the player need to become more efficient? So we need to be looking for where is energy gained or lost or whatnot. So what's your final point of the day here?
I would agree 100%. When I teach a very prescribed process of what's called the advanced foundation. It's coined in my books. But what that does, it allows me to be very, very flexible in how I move that player to accomplish these advanced patterns that are associated with every skilled forehand, backhand, whatever stroke. So a lot of coaches feel they've got that backwards. They think, no, I've got to teach a whole bunch of different things to meet the need of a bunch of different students. I say just the opposite. I want every one of my students to achieve great strokes. I'm going to use my personality and my imagination in many different ways to get all those different students to get to that point. Now, that being said, I'll close with this statement. I can teach 1,000 players the exact same stroke, and no two players will ever play the same way, because individual personality, perceptions of strengths and weaknesses, all those factors, you can look at every pro, and we know Djokovic can mimic a lot of these pros because we can identify the idiosyncrasies associated with the pros. So, I'm Hank Fisker and I talked a lot about this at one time, and he was talking about cloning players at academies. I said, hey, I've taught 3,000 players exactly the same thing, and guess what? No two of them play exactly alike. I've got twin brothers, twin sisters who I taught the exact same stroke, exact same processes, and one has a backhand that's one-handed, one has a two-handed backhand. One hits a huge kick serve, the other one hits a huge slice serve. I taught them exactly the same. So the bottom line is every player will take an advanced foundation and embellish it, manipulate it to be their own, but still usually within the pattern of the advanced foundation. That's why every pro looks different if you look at their idiosyncrasies. If you look at the foundation of every pro stroke, they're virtually identical, with obviously some exceptions. But I mean, if you look at what the racket's doing to the ball, it's almost identical. It's without fail. Golf is exactly the same way. The foundation of every golf swing on the Pro Tour is exactly the same, but every pro has a slightly different manipulative personality that is affiliated with that.
Awesome. And that's a wrap before my cat breaks down the door here. So,
perfect.
Anyway, so hey, thanks for your time, Dave. And we're going to see you next week. And you know what? I think next, let's try to do this. Let's try to have a Q&A session. If you want to come on our Zoom meeting,
sure.
The question,
yeah, that's invited.
Especially for high school coaches.